June, 1944. In a dim operations room somewhere in the Pacific, a Japanese officer leans over a map covered in pins and grease pencil lines. The pins used to mark expansion, victories, new borders. Now the pins are different. Now they mark what is missing. Ships that will never return. Fuel that will never arrive. Pilots who cannot be replaced in time. And the most terrifying part is that the map still looks large. The empire still looks wide. But an empire can look strong on paper while it is already dying in the arteries. Because by 1944, the Pacific War wasn't simply being fought on beaches and in the air. It was being decided by logistics, fuel, and time. And by the middle of that year, Japan was running out of all three. When people talk about the Pacific War, most conversations orbit around a dramatic ending. Firebombing raids, atomic bombs, surrender ceremonies, battles that feel like a final scene. But history rarely works like a movie. Wars often become decided long before they end. Not because one side gives up early, but because a set of conditions emerges that cannot be reversed. In the Pacific, those conditions were coming together by 1943. And by mid-1944, many of the most important pieces were already locked into place. This is the story of when the Pacific War was already lost, not by a single moment, but by a chain of irreversible realities. At the start of the war, Japan fought with speed, surprise, and skill. It struck hard, seized territory rapidly, and tried to build a defensive perimeter so vast that the United States would eventually choose negotiation over bloodshed. It wasn't a foolish plan in theory. It was a plan built around psychology, make the cost so high that the enemy hesitates. But it depended on something Japan could never truly control. Time. Because Japan's strategic position always carried a shadow, it was an island empire fighting an industrial giant. And in industrial war, time favors the side that can produce, train, and replace faster than you can destroy. The first cracks appeared early, even as Japan expanded. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 and Midway in June 1942 were not just tactical events. They were warnings. Midway in particular cost Japan irreplaceable carrier strength and, even more critically, experienced aircrew. Ships can be rebuilt. Time cannot. And veteran pilots, elite pilots, cannot be replaced quickly once they're gone. From that point onward, the war began shifting from who is braver to who can regenerate faster. The United States built a training pipeline that scaled. Japan did not scale at the same rate. This mattered more with every month that passed. Then came 1943. A year that doesn't always get the dramatic attention it deserves, but it is one of the most important years in the Pacific. Because 1943 was when the United States began turning the Pacific into an industrial campaign. It wasn't just battles anymore. It was process. Shipbuilding, airfield construction, convoy systems, logistics hubs, repair and replacement at scale. The United States did not simply fight for islands. It built systems on them. And once systems are in place, they amplify. They accelerate. They create momentum that is difficult to stop. Meanwhile, Japan faced a growing, deadly constraint: shipping. Japan was an island nation, but it was also an empire spread across huge distances. Its war economy depended on moving raw materials, oil, rubber, bauxite, iron, across the sea. Those sea lanes were the empire's bloodstream. And a bloodstream can be cut. American submarines began cutting it aggressively from the start of the war, and as the United States fixed early torpedo problems and improved tactics, the results became catastrophic for Japan. This wasn't glamorous warfare. It didn't look like a carrier duel. But strategically, it was lethal. Because a nation that cannot move fuel cannot fight. A nation that cannot move food cannot endure. A nation that cannot move raw materials cannot produce. By 1944, Japan's shipping losses and fuel strain were becoming a slow-motion strangulation. And then came the moment that many historians describe as the operational tipping point of the Pacific Air War. June, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. The clash itself was enormous, but the meaning was even larger. By this time, American carrier aviation had matured, better fighters, better radar direction, better pilot training, better coordination, and deep reserves of replacement aircraft and crews. Japan still had courage. It still had skill in pockets. But it did not have depth. When Japan lost aircraft and aircrew in large numbers in 1944, it wasn't like 1942. It wasn't a temporary setback. It was a permanent wound. And in that battle, Japan's carrier air arm was badly shattered. For Japan, this was not merely a defeat. It was the collapse of the tool that had made early victories possible. Now add the other layer, oil. By 1944, Japan's access to oil was under constant assault. American submarines and aircraft targeted tankers and shipping routes. The more the war continued, the less fuel Japan could move. Fuel shortages became a silent force shaping everything. Pilot training hours fell. Fleet operations became harder to sustain. Aircraft and ships existed on paper but could not be used freely. In late-war Japan, fuel wasn't just scarce. It became decisive. Because without fuel, readiness is fiction. By mid-1944, the American approach was becoming clear. It wasn't simply attack everything. It was isolate and bypass. The strategy often called island hopping. Instead of trying to capture every fortified position, American forces increasingly targeted key locations for airfields and naval bases, then bypassed strongholds that could be isolated and neutralized over time. This was not just tactical cleverness. It was strategic economy. It conserved lives. It conserved time. And because American submarines and air power could choke resupply, bypassed garrisons were often left stranded. Many Japanese soldiers on bypassed islands were not defeated by assault. They were defeated by isolation. This is one of the clearest signs that a war is tilting toward inevitability, when one side can choose where to fight, while the other side can only react. Another turning point came in late 1944. The Philippines. For Japan, the Philippines were not just another battlefield. They were a strategic artery. Losing effective control there threatened the flow of resources from Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies, especially oil. When American forces returned to the Philippines, Japan faced an impossible problem. It needed to stop the American advance. But its ability to sustain major fleet operations was diminishing. And the cost of losing was existential. This pressure contributed to increasingly desperate choices, including intensified kamikaze operations. Kamikaze tactics were not a sign of strength. They were a sign of scarcity. Scarcity of trained pilots. Scarcity of aircraft quality parity. Scarcity of fuel. Scarcity of alternatives. They were a gamble meant to impose fear and delay. But delay is not victory when your enemy's production, training, and logistics are accelerating. Meanwhile, American capacity continued to climb. This is one of the most important parts of the story, and it's also one of the least cinematic. America's war machine was not just fighting. It was learning and scaling. Carrier groups rotated. Ships were repaired quickly. New carriers arrived. New aircraft arrived. New pilots arrived. And behind all of it was a training system designed for replacement and continuity. Japan began the war with elite excellence. The United States built repeatable competence at scale. In long war, repeatable competence wins, because it regenerates faster than you can destroy it. By early 1945, Japan's strategic situation was tightening like a vice. Shipping losses made import of raw materials harder. Fuel shortages reduced training and operations. Air defenses struggled to contest American reach. Many outer positions were isolated. The Navy's ability to challenge American operations in open battle had declined sharply, and American air power was moving closer and closer to the home islands. This is where we need to understand something uncomfortable, but true. By 1945, Japan was still capable of inflicting enormous casualties. A cornered power can be extremely dangerous. But the question is not, can it still fight? The question is, can it still win? By 1944, especially after the loss of effective carrier aviation and the worsening fuel and shipping crisis, Japan's path to victory was narrowing toward zero. This does not mean surrender was automatic. Japan's leadership faced internal divisions, political constraints, and an intense commitment to fighting on. There were still debates, still factions, still hopes of better terms, still fear of occupation, still concern for the imperial institution, and still an expectation that the homeland would be defended at extraordinary cost. But strategy is not only psychology. Strategy is also math. And Japan's math was collapsing. Because modern war demands for things in constant flow. Fuel, ships, trained personnel, industrial output. If one collapses, the others strain. If several collapse at once, the war becomes a countdown. Now consider what was happening to Japan's cities and industry. Japan's war production was not always concentrated in massive single factories. Many components were produced in smaller workshops embedded across urban areas. That decentralization made some aspects of production resilient early. But it also meant that wide-area destruction of cities could cripple output quickly. As American air power improved, and as more B-29 operations gained momentum, pressure on Japanese industry and civil infrastructure intensified. This mattered because Japan didn't just need to fight battles. It needed to keep its economy functioning while under attack. And by 1945, that became increasingly difficult. At the same time, the naval blockade tightened. Food supplies became a growing issue. Distribution networks came under pressure. Civil order strained. When a society is fighting for survival internally while also facing external invasion threats, strategic options narrow. Again, the war becomes a countdown. This is the part of the story where many people focus on a single question. Would Japan have surrendered without the atomic bombs? Historians debate this intensely, and the debate exists for a reason. The end of wars involves politics, psychology, and timing, not only military capability. But regardless of where you land in that debate, one fact remains widely accepted. By 1945, Japan's ability to sustain modern war had been severely damaged by blockade and bombing. And by mid-1944, the trajectory was increasingly irreversible. Japan could still fight brutally. But it could not restore the conditions needed to win. So when, exactly, was the Pacific War already lost? Not on one day. But if you're looking for the period when the strategic foundation became nearly impossible to rebuild, you look at mid-1944. Because by then, Japan's carrier air arm had been devastated. The American industrial and training machine was operating at full speed. Submarine warfare was strangling shipping and fuel movement. American forces had seized key positions that enabled deeper strikes. Japan's ability to contest air and sea control was shrinking. And crucially, the United States could choose where to apply pressure next. That is what inevitability looks like. Not instant surrender, but a shrinking set of options until none remain. There is a human element to this that often gets lost when we talk about strategy. A Japanese pilot in 1944 could still be brave. A sailor could still fight. An infantryman could still hold a cave position with stubborn determination. But bravery cannot create fuel. Courage cannot build replacement carriers faster than your enemy. Sacrifice cannot restore shipping lanes once the ocean is dominated by submarines and aircraft. When the system collapses, individual heroism becomes tragedy. And that is one of the most sobering truths of industrial war. Now, if you're an American listening to this, there is a reason these facts often produce a very specific feeling, one that is not arrogance, but something quieter. Respect. Because victory in the Pacific was not inevitable because America was better people. It became inevitable because America mobilized. It organized. It built. It trained. It created systems that did not rely on miracles. And those systems carried millions across an ocean, sustained them, and kept moving forward even after setbacks. That is not cheap. It is not easy. And it is not automatic. It requires unity and endurance on a national scale. That is what the Pacific War tested. And by 1944, Japan was fighting against something it could not exhaust. The Pacific War is remembered for its brutality. And it was brutal. Island battles were among the harshest in modern history. Civilian suffering was immense. Casualties and trauma were staggering. But when we ask, when was it already lost, we are not trying to reduce the sacrifice. We are trying to understand how wars actually end. Not with one final dramatic moment, but with a slow tightening of constraints. Fuel, shipping, training, production, air and sea control. By mid-1944, those constraints were converging. And once they converge, the final months are often not about whether the war will end. They are about how much it will cost before it ends. This is why battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa mattered so much. Not because they decided the war in a vacuum, but because they revealed what an invasion of the home islands might look like. And that leads directly into what comes next in our series. Because by 1945, the United States was planning something that would have dwarfed anything seen before in the Pacific. Operation Downfall. The invasion that never happened. The final battle that would have turned entire coastlines into fire. And here is the key connection. By the time Downfall was planned, the Pacific War was already leaning heavily toward American victory. But ending it decisively, still threatened to cost an unimaginable number of lives. So when the Pacific War was already lost, it didn't mean it was over. It meant the foundation had collapsed. It meant Japan's options were shrinking. It meant the war was moving toward an ending that could be forced, one way or another, by a nation that could mobilize faster, sustain longer, and strike deeper every month. In industrial war, that is the ultimate advantage. Not a single weapon. Not a single battle. But a system that keeps working. A system that keeps producing. A system that does not get tired. And next time, we look at the invasion that would have followed. The invasion that would have made D-Day look small. And why it never happened.